Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and we are talking today with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who is a representative for Brattleboro. And we are talking about, how should we phrase this, Emilie? The legislative session that kind of hasn't ended, but sort of will recess and then start again?
I've been actually trying to figure out how to put that into, say, like a tweet or a Facebook post, and I have not gotten anywhere. So I will leave it to you. Yes, the session was supposed to end in May. It's going, we're hypothetically pausing at the end of the day today, and then we're going to come back in September or August. That also seems to be unclear. So yes, but there's some wrapping up that's happening right now.
Okay. Now, before we talk about the legislative session and what's wrapping up right now, I'm a little curious because you said coming back in either August or September. You know, we have a primary and campaigning and re-elections or elections for the first time coming up.
Yeah.
How is that all going to fit? I mean, because there's a tradition in the Vermont State House that you're not supposed to be campaigning while you're serving the people in the legislature. Mm-hmm. Like the time isn't supposed to overlap, but it's going to.
So there is that tradition, unfortunately, or whatever. I don't know if it's unfortunate or not. I haven't had time to actually particularly form an opinion about this, but that's been really fading the last few years. So even when we were still in the building, which was February, no time.
That lifetime before COVID.
So even when we were still in the building, which was before town meeting week, because when we came back after town meeting week, that was the last week before we left. So early March, February, there were a number of announcements about LG and governor races that were already sort of kicked off. So, and then at town meeting, traditionally people tend to announce whether or not they're running again, or they collect signatures. So there's some sort of campaign energy already happening at the end of a biennium. And I was sort of, as this is my first biennium, I was warned about how things sort of get more politicized as we go on. But it's getting more and more heightened. I think particularly in the Senate, because we have the Senate pro tem running for lieutenant governor and another senator running for lieutenant governor, things are quite dynamic.
Popcorn worthy?
What?
Popcorn worthy?
Popcorn worthy, yes. And so in some ways that helps things move along, and in some ways that, doesn't always support great decision making. In the House, there are very few House members who have primaries. And so it's the general election that House members who have tough races are most concerned about. There's a few cases of primaries, but generally, as we've talked about many, many, many months ago when I was first elected, people tend to not primary sitting legislators. A trend that we also know is changing nationally if we look at what just happened in the New York primaries. Mm-hmm. So, or Kentucky. I guess that wasn't a sitting legislator. But it changes things. And I think for folks who have a race, it's really, really complicated. And as we get closer and closer to the general election, it's going to be even more complicated. Mm-hmm. Because conversations that, might have faded into the background in another election year are going to rise up to the foreground. So I know that people in more purple districts, so, with a more of a mix of Democrats and Republicans than say we might have here in Brattleboro, really there's an emphasis on not having any gun legislation the second half of biennium, that you do that the first half of the biennium, which is like a level of legislative scheduling that would never occur to me as a person who just like really tries to legislate with my values and evidence, and I tend to
Mm-hmm.
so that's interesting. It's interesting to watch things get heightened, and one of the things that got really heightened recently was the Pay Act.
Right, which is one of the things we're going to talk about
Yeah.
this morning. So as you mentioned, and just before we go on to legislation, I'll just note that I don't believe there are any contested races in the Brattleboro district, but for the Putney, Dummerston, I think that's Wyndham 4.
Yes, it is.
Yep, that has some contested races.
Mm-hmm.
The Matt Treber, what we've traditionally thought of as the Matt Treber Carolyn Partridge district,
Mm-hmm.
that has some contested races, and then I think we're going to see some over in the Deerfield Valley as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure yet because some of the people in that area tend to file independent. And they don't have to file yet.
Okay.
And so I noticed some independents were missing from the Secretary of State's list of who's filed papers to run. So that's what I mean. I'm not sure, but we might.
And so we might still have independents running in Brattleboro too. So none of
that's true.
Just filed for the primaries. So just Democrats, Republicans, and progressives have filed for the primaries. And so we might have independents running in, Brattleboro, Guilford, Vernon, who knows. But
Good
yes,
point.
Because Nodder isn't running again, there's a very wide open race in that district. So Mike Markey technically has a primary. And then in Rockingham, there was an appointment of Kelly Tully to replace Matt Treber's spot. But Leslie Goldman, who was actually got more votes from that area Democrats, and her name was also sent up as a nomination. So I think she's declared to run as well, and so that's going to be an interesting race up there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What's been another sort of like election gossip piece that's interesting is this year, for whatever reason, and this is happening throughout the state, a lot of Republicans are running in Democratic primaries.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so there's sort of a long-standing, I'm not going to call this a tradition, but progressives have often run in Democratic primaries. And then once they win the Democratic primary, they sort of flip to being a progressive for the general. And that's something that happens in Chittenden County a lot. It doesn't really happen down here. But it happened recently in Windsor, which is sort of close to here in the last race. And so that same trend, for whatever reason, seems to be happening this year with Republicans running in the Democratic race. And my understanding is that some of the folks running in that Putney, Dummerston, Westminster district have historically voted Republican.
So, okay, curiosity factor here from the journalist. Yeah. If they're a Republican running in the Democratic primary, will they have an R next to their name or a D next to their name?
They would have, you mean after they win the primary?
No, when people go to check their name on the ballot.
You don't, in Vermont, which is different from a lot of other states, you don't actually have to ever declare a party. Like as a voter, like every time you go vote, you just get to pick which ballot you want. And I've heard about people sort of like voting, getting a Republican primary ballot because they like want to vote for like the lesser of two evils or the greater of two evils because they think the greater evil will win. Well, whatever. I don't know. Everyone has their own strategy for voting. But so that person, then you just get to they have a D next to their name in the primary, on the primary ballot. But then hypothetically could drop that D for the general.
So is that fair to the voters?
I don't think it's fair to anyone, but I also don't, party is a very...
Yeah, they're not as strong in Vermont as they are.
It's not very strong in Vermont, and the party platform, which each party's sort of town, county, state mechanisms develop, does not bear a very strong resemblance to the legislation that gets pushed in any given year by the members of that party in the legislature. And so there's a disconnect there. In some Republicans' defense, I know there's a lot of people who are really sort of unhappy with the direction the Republican Party has gone in Vermont or has gone nationally, and the actual party apparatus in Vermont is very aligned with the National Republican Party, though a lot of members of that party are much more sort of, I don't know, Snelling Republicans or something. So it's complicated. There are a lot of people who consider themselves Democrats, even now in the legislature, who I would say are probably more moderate Republicans than Democrats, if we look at sort of what the origins and the values and the platform of the party are. So, there's no purity test.
This is true.
And voters should really be looking closely at what someone's history is, what someone's values are, and what policies they're really committing to push, as well as what endorsements they're receiving. Because a lot of the groups that do endorsements do some are pretty serious in the questions that they ask and the issues they ask you to grapple with.
Yeah, it does remind us that we need to be informed voters. Yeah. And can't just show up and be like, well, I know them, but I don't know them.
Yeah, totally. And then in my own race, I filed my paperwork, but I haven't even finished sort of an announcement to send to the paper yet, or officially started campaigning, partly because there's no knocking on doors, and partly because I think my time is better spent focusing on my legislating right now, because there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of constituent work to do, supporting people to get unemployment and all of that. But it's hard because I think elections are really exciting. And it's a really good opportunity to talk to people about what they care about in a way that people aren't always willing to do. So I'm hoping to dive into that if this recess actually happens.
Well, good luck.
Thanks.
Both getting to the recess and grappling with the rest of the summer.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the recent legislation that has passed, as well as what might be wrapped up today. You mentioned the Pay Act, which has to do with legislative pay, but it also involves some other aspects as well.
Yeah, the Pay Act has very little to do with legislative pay. So most of what the Pay Act is the pay for employees of state government. And so it's the legislative mechanism that connects to the budget whatever the collective bargaining agreement is between the administration and the various unions. So, the SEA, the state employees, the police union, et cetera. The judiciary has its own bargaining unit. And so that's what the Pay Act is. And so it pays for the employees of state government to get their pay, and puts in some other mechanisms connected to that. And so as part of that, there's also mechanisms and organizing around elected official pay. And so historically, legislative pay has been in its own little standalone category. And we are moving it into the category with the other elected officials, which are called constitutional officers. So the treasurer, the auditor, the governor, all those sort of lieutenant governor, all those statewide officers, they're considered constitutional officers. I'm a little fuzzy today. It's been a very, very long week here in the hypothetical Montpelier that lives inside of my computer. And so we're moving our pay in with that. But the bigger issue is the conversation around the collective bargaining agreement, because in sort of an exciting move, for the first time in many years, the VSEA and the administration agreed on contracts without going to arbitrators, without going to arbitration, without going to the Labor Relations Board, really just came to an agreement between the two parties without outside forces jumping in. And so that's a really exciting win for sort of the trust within the organization of state government. And what that meant, actually, part of that bargain is a really interesting piece that usually state employees get a COLA, a cost of living increase, every year, and then step increases. And step increases are sort of, you move into a different pay bucket. I can like see the step increase chart in my head from when I was a state employee, but it's hard for me to explain it with the words. So step increases are when you basically like move slightly from one position to the next. You get an assigned raise because you're considered in a different category of pay. And some people get them at different times and some people get them at other times. It depends on how long you've been at your position and a bunch of other stuff. And then the COLA, or the cost of living increase, is a percentage of your pay that goes up every year. And what's interesting about a COLA is that the more money you make, the more your COLA is, because it's a percentage. Right?
Good point.
Yeah. And so this year, as part of the collective bargaining agreement, and really acknowledging that these are complex times for state government, instead of doing a COLA, there is a flat amount of money that is going to every state employee. And it is as almost like a bonus. And so for employees that are on sort of the bottom half of the pay scale, it's actually more money than they would get as a COLA. And for state employees that are on the upper half, it's actually less money than they would get as a COLA, or probably the upper quarter. And so it's a much more equitable extra disbursement. However, it does not go into ongoing increases. So if there's a COLA next, in 2 years, it would be on what the base is now. It's not added to their base pay. And so there's some interesting pros and cons there. And it helped everyone come into compromise, because there's aspects of it that are quite progressive pay-wise, and then there are aspects of it that are regressive and that we're not actually increasing the base. And so that was the grand agreement that was struck. There was a lot of debate in the House about, and I believe in the Senate as well, but I was not there for that, about whether or not this is the right time to fully fund state government and to fully fund the employees of state government, given all of the confusion around how much money we have and what the economy is doing and COVID and all of that. And a number of legislators wanted to reopen the collective bargaining agreement, wanted to force a renegotiation of the collective bargaining agreement because of this scarcity mentality. And I'm really, really pleased to say that we did not do that, that we, voted yes in support of the collective bargaining agreement for the first year. And that we really, and I think it's really important to understand that, a lot of people were saying like, well, there are folks in our communities that are suffering, and so everyone should suffer, right? But if everyone suffers, we all just sort of spin our way tumbling down the hill. We have some people that are still have stable incomes while other people are suffering. The people with stable incomes can continue to spend in order to create more opportunities for other people within the economy. They can continue to have the extra resources to volunteer. There's just like a lot, you want to keep as many people stable economically in a community as you possibly can, especially in a recession. And one of the sort of interesting macro pieces of community economic development is the more large stable institutions you have, and state government and universities and hospitals are sort of huge part of that. The more of those you have in an economy, often the more the economy can thrive. because that stability really begets prosperity. And so
Mhm.
I think now more than ever, it's an important time for us to invest in state employee pay.
So I know that this session COVID has thrown all sorts of things to the wind this session, but you and I have talked about wages in Vermont a lot, and we've
So
talked
much.
about the data
Mhm.
showing how really not great in general our wages tend to be in this state. I
Mhm.
think we rank in New England like 5
Mhm.
out of 6 as far as
And New
wages
Hampshire is
go.
the only one. Is New
Hmm?
Hampshire the only one? Is New Hampshire the only one worse than us?
No, I think it's Maine.
Maine.
Yep. So I'm curious, just in general, has the legislature ever acknowledged that our wages statewide just tend to be lower than our neighbors? And that can cause as many, not all, but some of our demographic issues that we're wrestling with. If people can't make it here financially, why would they stay?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that was ever acknowledged.
So the legislature as a body doesn't really acknowledge much, right?
Mhm.
Um,
I'm just gonna let that sit there.
yeah. I mean, because like it's a lot of people in a room, and so they'd all have to agree with something and understand something to acknowledge it as a body, right?
Right.
So I mean, I suppose when we pass a resolution, we are technically all acknowledging something as a body. But we just passed a resolution about Juneteenth and Black Lives Matter. And
Mhm.
I wouldn't say that it meant that we were actually acknowledging it as a body. So it's certainly a conversation that happens that I was sort of regular raising in the Commerce Committee. I think it comes up a lot. I think there's, the constant battle between the conversation around wages and the conversation around affordability and which one wins. And I think you and I have talked a lot about how, it's the wages, not the affordability, because when we just focus on affordability and not wages, then we basically set ourselves up to be a developing nation and not a member of, the US,
Right.
in line with our neighbors. And I think people really disagree on sort of the theory of change of what it would take to improve wages.
Mhm.
So, and then there's also the very real situation that we've talked about a lot. And my colleague, Lucy Rogers, who's 23, I think she's 23. She might be 24. Um, she's, she sort of framed very eloquently that she's not sure that our colleagues who tend to be baby boomers really can understand the tremendous economic pressure that younger folks are under, that it really is unprecedented. And the wage gap really between, Generation X, millennials, and boomers is remarkable nationwide, but particularly in Vermont.
Yeah.
And so given the hypothetical citizen legislature and the fact that, we make $12,000 a year. And so in order to be able to serve making $12,000 a year, you need to have some other path
Mhm.
towards money. We have a pretty tippy, top heavy group of legislators who really, I don't think, do understand what wages look like in Vermont,
Mhm.
and how incredibly disconnected they are from the needs that we all have. So no, I don't think the legislature has acknowledged that.
The reason I ask is that old maxim that where intention goes, energy flows,
Yeah.
and so sometimes I wonder, like, I know that as a legislature, the more perspectives you have, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want people to agree or disagree on issues. But I wonder sometimes, like, do we know what we're actually moving towards
Mm-hmm.
if we haven't agreed on some basic values or goals or things that the state needs.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I asked that question.
No, I mean, it's probably the number one conversation I've been trying to push since I got there, as well as really this idea that we need to agree on the problem before we can find the solution, which is something that we often don't do. And so some of that is some discipline around how we think about legislation, which is is something that's been really important to me as a member of the Government Accountability Committee. And then there's sort of this second stage of really reckoning with this issue of wages. And there are a lot of reports that we receive, especially the Women Work and Wages report, which was really powerful and we've talked about before. But people don't necessarily read reports, and you can read reports and not like really integrate them into your experience of the world, because it's just something on paper. I don't know, Olga. It's hard. It's really hard to get people to understand something that's so different from their lived experience. It's the same thing that we, see when we talk about structural racism. And if you are, a fairly wealthy, comfortable person, or even someone who's not that wealthy, but bought their house in the 60s or 70s in Vermont, and so either don't have a mortgage or have a remarkably low mortgage, I don't think you can really, you likely have friends in very similar circumstances because that's how social groups work. And so I really don't think that I think it's really hard for people to get their head around. And I think it's really, really important if we're going to build a Vermont where people can live, let alone thrive. And so when we were looking at legislation to sort of stabilize the business environment, given the incredible impacts of sort of COVID shutdowns, I put forward a proposal with the Working Vermonters Caucus and the Women's Caucus. It was sort of a partnered proposal that said, we are going to prioritize businesses that, pay a certain wage, have certain benefits, respect workers' rights, because we know that not every business in Vermont is going to survive this, right? Like, that's really hard, really scary. Saying that to the person whose business isn't going to survive is a heartbreaking proposition. And change happens, right? And we don't have enough money from the feds to make good on every loss. There isn't enough money to do that. So if we know we're going to have change and loss and shifts, why not prioritize those places that we know the majority of Vermonters would benefit from? But that's a really sticky wicket, because then you're, picking winners and losers, and legislators hate to do that because the loser might be like the person who emails them the most. It becomes very politically complicated, especially in an election year, and would also sort of slow down the money getting out the door because there would be, a gate to pass through, or a filter or screen or something like that. I don't want to call it a gate. And so that was not included in the final package, unfortunately. And so let's see, we are spending
for our radio listeners, Emilie's looking at her notes right now. Oh, look at them, and they're color-coded even.
I know, I'm really, we got a printer. Never had a home printer. Oh, I just switched away from gallery view. How did I do that?
I don't know.
Gallery view. There we go. Okay. We got a color printer right before the COVID hit, which is really great because I think it would be really hard to be at home without a printer. And generally, I've always avoided having a printer at home because they tend to break constantly. I find them to be sort of like sewing machines. Like, they're really awesome for a week, and then something gets jammed and you don't know how to fix it, and then you give up on it, or at least I do. But anyway, so color printer, we are spending around $90 million. That's not right. That's reserved for later. We are spending $800 million. $800 million. It's an enormous amount of money. And of that money, the vast majority of it is really going to support businesses. Some of those might be healthcare businesses like hospitals, but the majority of it is going to support businesses and is going directly to the directors, owners of those businesses.
And that 800 million is from the federal CARES?
That's from the federal,
Okay.
yeah, it's from the COVID relief funds. And so given all of that money going out, it seems like a really powerful opportunity to leverage some changes in how, how Vermont's economy is structured, how wages are paid, who wins and who loses, who benefits. And so that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's just going out like that. And not that I don't think that we want to make sure that we're really, keeping our main streets vibrant, and knowing, of course, that if a business closes, then all of the people working there lose their jobs. But I think we could really put our values to this budget in a way that would build a more vibrant Vermont, or at least a Vermont that we isn't less vibrant after January. So that's disappointing, and there's other things in here that aren't disappointing, and I'm happy to talk about too.
Okay, fantastic. We need to go to break to hear from our underwriters. But I also want to acknowledge that finding common values and coming up with a common set of priorities also takes time. And let's face it, that's something that, especially with COVID, a lot of people have not had. So I want to acknowledge that too. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP, your community radio station, will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP, Brattleboro 107.7 FM, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I'm talking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser today. And we should note that the opinions expressed on this show are ours and only ours, and not the radio station's. Emilie.
Olga.
So before the break, we were talking about some of the legislation that has passed in this kind of session that has not ended and is only recessing and going to start again session. And you brought up the 800 million that's coming from the federal COVID relief monies to Vermont. And can we talk a little bit about where some of that money is going in the state?
Please. And it's around $1 billion that's coming from the feds in total. And a little bit of it we're setting aside to make some decisions about in the fall. And a little bit of it a lot of it actually has been spent already by the governor. So today is hypothetically the last day of this section of the session. And we are trying to, and I think I mentioned this on a previous Montpelier Happy Hour, but as we've said, time is complicated these days. So instead of passing a full year budget before we leave, which is what we would normally do in May, or even April, we are just passing a first quarter budget.
That's right.
Which I like to think of it as the fifth quarter of FY20 instead of the first quarter of FY21, but whatever people's brains enjoys can work. So, and so all of the COVID relief funding is sort of woven into that in a certain way. And a few other bills that are sort of connected to appropriations. And so that conversation, there was a conversation in the Senate, there was a conversation in the House sent over our proposal, the Senate did their tweaking, much tweaking, sent it back. They just sent it back last night, voted it out last night. And so today we're going to be doing, and somehow this is what happens every year, like this degree of like last minute down to the wire decision making. So uncomfortable, like you said, right before the break. Not sure the best decisions get made in this environment. This is how government works.
Mm-hmm.
So today the House is hypothetically going to negotiate and or concur with what the Senate proposed. So nothing that I'm talking about here is definite. It's the final squeezing together down to the wire. So I have, yeah.
We should just note that while this is broadcasting at 2 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
on WVEW, we're actually recording it at 8 a.m. before you go on the floor.
Mm-hmm. And I would say even at 2 p.m. when this airs, none of this will be definite still. I would say like more like 9 o'clock tonight.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and maybe even tomorrow morning. We got threatened with that yesterday.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, which I think, just for readers to note, is an interesting phenomenon around the legislature that, so we might come back on a Saturday, but I can tell you we would never come back on a Sunday because that is the Sabbath. And
well, for some people.
For some people. In fact, Saturday is the Sabbath for many other people, not just Jewish people, but also Muslims, maybe even some other people that I don't know about. And so it's just like one of the many ways that, you know, cultural hegemony gets the better of us. So onwards to where all this money is going. And apologies to any listeners. It's been a long week and a long month and a long collection of months, so I'm a little wired this morning. So, financial assistance to businesses. There's like a whole category there that totals around $200 million. And it's a combination of stuff that's been that's going back and forth, sort of which buckets things go into. But I'll talk about those sort of buckets because I think they're interesting. So there's one section that's a little more than $1 million that is support to micro businesses. And that would be through the community action agencies.
Just for folks' context.
So here that would be SEVCA.
Thank you.
And every county has an agency like SEVCA called their community action agency. And those were really an essential part of the war on poverty in the 60s and 70s. Those were established throughout the country. And so that is funding going to support to, you know, sole proprietor businesses with an emphasis on women and minority owned businesses. The language in the legislation says minority owned, but it's not the language I would use if I had drafted the legislation. Because in most areas of the country, white people are actually in the minority, so we should stop using that language. There is a combination of around $40 million that is going to the agricultural sector. Maybe even more than that. And so that's divided up in different ways if you look at the Senate and the House versions, but some of that is grants directly to milk producers and processors. That's around $25 million. And there's been a lot of conversations about how that is not going to, that's probably going to go directly to vendors to pay back bills. And so that has sort of interesting implications. $5 million to ag producers and processors. That would include cheese, maple syrup, apparently a shrimp farm. Who knew there was a Vermont shrimp farm? I found out on the House floor. I'm kind of excited about it. Forest economy stabilization grants. That's wood processors who are, from everything we've heard, are sort of going to feel the pinch of this a little bit further down the line. The Senate wants to give some money to agricultural fairs. The House didn't. And then $1 million to somewhere more than $5 million, but less than $10 million is likely going to go to the Working Lands Fund, which is a really interesting program that provides grants to anyone who does anything related to working lands. And so that can be farmers, it can be foresters, it's a pretty broad swath. It can include agritourism, and they provide tremendous amount of technical assistance along with their grants to really help folks who are working the land in some way really get their head around the business proposition of how to do this well. And we can see spots throughout Windham County where that money has made a really big difference for businesses to turn the curve around having a more stable business model for themselves. So it's one of those places of successful strategy that Vermont is sort of continuing to invest in, because we see that those grants really pay off because of the way they're executed. There is $70 million that's going out through the tax department and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to businesses who have suffered losses that they can show from their tax receipts. And so there's the first tranche of money that's going to businesses who have suffered more than a 75% loss, and then another tranche of money going out for folks who have suffered more than a 50% loss in business, in income. And so that's the money that I was talking about in terms of how is that going to impact wages and folks who are working. Where will when that money hits a business, where will it go? Is it going straight to profits? Is it going to vendors? Is it going to the folks working there to rehire them? And the one piece of equity that's built into that legislation right now is that people need to certify compliance with labor laws. Seems like a nice bare minimum. And then the other piece is that has to be an equity in geographic distribution of that, which is great. Mm-hmm. Because we want to make sure that it's not just the folks who are sort of first in the gate who get the money, because that was a big problem with some of the federal funding, like the PPP grants.
Yeah, yeah.
There is onwards. So if we put all that money together, that's like between ACCD and tax, we're getting somewhere in like the 140 million mark, 150 million mark. There was some funding in there for partners of the Agency of Transportation. So like the folks who work on our roads, et cetera, who are contracted to work on our roads, who were paused for a few months. Mm-hmm. But it's not clear if that money is going to stay in there. And that's just a few corporations. So it's really not mm-hmm. clear on if that's the best use of funding. But if you work in that industry, I'm sure it feels like it is.
Yeah.
Onwards. Grants to the Arts Council for $5 million for them to redistribute to arts and cultural organizations who we know experienced a huge hit from this because folks could not gather, and most right. art is related to people gathering to experience said art. Mm-hmm. More than $1 million going to outdoor recreation work and businesses who might need to put in place some adaptations in order to meet health needs. $5 million to the Vermont Community Loan Fund to support nonprofits. Somewhere between $10 and $15 million to reimburse local government for COVID costs. Mm-hmm. And there's likely going to be another piece of federal legislation that's also connected to that. And then there was $1 million in the House version for a program called the Better Places Program.
Right.
Which I was pretty excited about because it's the only place in this where we're really focused on what comes next, mm-hmm. not what's happening. Mm-hmm. But that seems to have been removed in the Senate version. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Huh. And those were sort of micro grants for communities who wanted to revitalize main streets, bring people together, like sort of placemaking activities. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's all the business support stuff basically is in that big category. And the total grants in that category that are going to businesses are around $93 million.
Okay.
And all the things I just said. And then to agricultural producers, we sort of come up with a total of around a little more than $200 million. Onwards.
Next bucket.
Next bucket. Technical and marketing assistance is somewhere between $9 and $10 million. That is likely a lot of that would go out through the regional development corporations to provide assistance to businesses to do various ways they need to adapt to this new environment, whether it's the new economy or health or whatever, as well as support to businesses in marketing. And then also a $2 million that's been sort of a long-standing project around the Secretary of State's business portal, which really desperately needs some updating in order to collect both excitingly demographic information about business owners, which we don't have, as well as really streamlining all of the various registrations and regulations that a person needs to be in compliance, putting this all in one place so you don't have to sort of bop around. I don't know if, when I opened a cafe on Elliott Street, I was really shocked at how, you know, every license is dependent on the last license, but they all come from different offices. And that was just a small cafe. I can't imagine what it's like for a much larger organization that might have also environmental concerns. So that's somewhere between $9 and $10 million. The next chunk of money I'm very excited about because it's something that we have talked about before on here, which is somewhere between $85 and $95 million going for housing assistance.
Hey, nice.
And so that is, yes. And so that is $23 million for the Vermont Housing Conservation Board to put out housing grants. And I should have reminded our listeners at the beginning of this that all of this money has to be spent by December 30th. I don't know why it's not December 31st, because there are 31 days in December, but it is December 30th that all this money needs to be spent by, which is not very much money, not very much time to spend an enormous amount of money that has a lot of restrictions connected to it. So the $23 million for VHCB housing grants is for doing exactly that project that we talked about, where someone in our community or a coalition in our community would buy a motel to sort of stabilize transitional housing opportunities for our community. So that's one example of a project that money might go towards. And so that's really exciting because we had managed to house all Vermonters for a short period of time and really don't want to give up on that promise. And so this is an opportunity to really take that next step. Knowing that we need to build more housing stock, like permanent housing stock, but one cannot do that before December 30th. No.
Or you could, but probably no one would want to live there because it would fall down around their ears within a couple years.
Indeed. Indeed. And then, so there's $550 million to Vermont Legal Aid to support folks who are experiencing legal housing challenges around evictions and foreclosures and such. Another $250 million around landlord counseling and assistance. And a lot of that money goes to housing rehab. And if folks get rehab funds, they are required to keep that property affordable for 5 years, or in the last version that I read. And so that goes on foreclosure protection, eviction protection, rehousing recovery. So that's more of sort of our standard housing model with support to our housing agencies for that. And then further money for the Department of Children and Families housing incentives. And so that all adds up to between $85 and $95 million and has sort of some immediate opportunities for folks who are struggling with housing, as well as some midterm opportunities for rehabbing housing stock that's offline, as well as purchasing motels and such for longer term housing. So that is, I'm not sure enough money is going into this to fully meet the need, but it's really hitting each of the necessary buckets in a meaningful way. And so that's really exciting.
Nice. That's good to hear.
It is really good to hear. Next bucket, somewhere between $25 and $45 million for technology connectivity assistance.
So is that internet? Is that?
That is a combination of broadband, last mile grants, especially going to folks who need it for school or telehealth. Some of that is going to the Public Service Department for ratepayer arrearages, hard word to say. So we know that there was a moratorium, which is an easier word to say, essentially a pause on being able to shut off things. We weren't allowed to, corporations weren't allowed to shut off electricity, telephones, internet for a short period of time during the emergency order or evictions, right? But it's not as if those bills didn't go away. And so we're seeing a lot of people who might have accumulated 6 months worth of bills and then all of a sudden have to pay it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this is funding to support people to pay off those arrearages. Which is great. And then there's also some money there going towards cybersecurity for the Agency of Digital Services. I think specifically to support state employees to work from home if we have a second surge, when we have a second surge. And so that piece of the bill seems to have had a lot more fluctuation in what the strategies are. And I haven't had a chance to read the side-by-sides on the language about what's happening there yet. So I can't tell you more about the specific connectivity strategies that are contained there, because I get the feeling from looking by the side-by-side budgets that the Senate had a very different idea about how to do this well than the House did.
So I just want to let you know, Emilie,
Yes.
so you can prioritize. We have about 5 minutes left.
What?
I know this. We went a little too long on the first half, so now the second half is just like.
It's always too much fun. Maybe we should have a 3-hour show. Just kidding. Just kidding.
We would have fun. I don't know if listeners.
I know
would,
the listeners might be
would.
like, "Whoa, these people! They really like talking to each other." Okay,
they need to get out more often. We can't. It's COVID.
Going faster here. The next tranche of money is healthcare money. That is somewhere around $370 million at the max. Wow. Some of that is going to address health disparities. Some of that's might be going to suicide prevention. Some of that's going to stabilize adult day programs and EMS programs, who really experienced a lot of challenges around their Medicaid billing model during shutdown, because they were fee-for-service. A lot of fee-for-service agencies were really struggling, and this is sort of to make them whole so they don't shut down. And then a bunch of money to really support hospitals who also suffered significant losses because they stopped doing elective procedures. Food. $23 million, and we talked about that last week. So if listeners want to know what the legislature is doing around food security, we did a great interview with Margaret Atkinson about that last week. Go listen to it. And then $14 million for child care and family supports for vulnerable populations. And so that is increases in Reach Up, Children's Integrated Services, parent-child centers, child care, summer camps, etc. A lot more to say about that I'm not going to say right now. Some work on public health. The Attorney General has a racial disparity project. The Director of Racial Equity in the legislature, in the administration. That's just somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. So I don't really even know why I'm putting it in here, but it's listed as its own line item. So I guess I can tell constituents about it. And then some stuff around state lands and public health. That's somewhere around $3 million total. And that's it. Oh, did I talk about reimbursements to local government? I did. That's everything.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Those are all the dollars that are hypothetically going to be spent to keep Vermont as whole as it can be, given the tremendous challenges that we have experienced and that I think we're going to experience into the future. And so I'm really happy about the buckets and the way some of those buckets were thought about. And I think we are still going to have a lot more to do on the other side of this.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So before we sign off, today, what bills are being considered?
So there's all of that budget bills, and there's sort of all those pieces are in a few different bills that have numbers, and then things keep on being pulled out of one bill and into another bill because of different mechanisms of moving things forward that are confusing and not interesting to anyone. And then we're also looking at an act relating to addressing racial bias and excessive use of force by law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
That's called S219. It is still quite in flux. There's a big tension between moving fast and moving well, always in the legislature, particularly in this instance. And we're going to spend all of next week's Montpelier Happy Hour talking about racial justice and criminal justice. So I'm going to not get too far into the weeds on that.
Yeah.
And then there's an interesting bill on workers' compensation and how workers' comp insurance might be able to provide a presumption of eligibility for folks who get COVID on the job. And then there's a maternal mortality review panel, and a second bit of legislation around Abenaki, I don't call it restitution, but Abenaki, it's maybe a path to restitution or restoration. And so this is we passed a bill around Abenaki hunting and fishing licenses at some point recently, a couple weeks ago, I think. Yeah. And then yesterday we passed second reading and third reading on an Abenaki place names bill. And so whenever a place names plaque is replaced at some state-owned facility, the Abenaki place name for that location will be added as well. And so that's a nice way of sort of bringing our history into the present that we should have done long ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Emilie.
You're welcome.
That was a real race to the finish, but you did it.
I did it.
And good luck the rest of the day at the legislature. So this is all the time we have for today's Montpelier Happy Hour. Oh, we have to do a toast.
I have a toast.
Oh, please do.
Okay. To rest in the color red, including roses, strawberries, tomatoes, and all that is available to us in the height of summer. May it translate into our budgets.
You're here. Abundance for all. Thank you for joining us here on the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 FM, your community radio station. Emilie, where can folks find you if they have questions?
They can find me at emiliekornheiser.org, ekornheiser@gmail.com, ekornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And every Saturday morning, do a legislative roundtable on Zoom, 9 a.m. You can find that on Front Porch Forum or Facebook.
And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour on the Vermontitude SoundCloud page or the Vermontitude Facebook page. Have a great weekend, everyone.